Hi guys! If you don't already know me, my name is Victoria Paulino and I'm currently in college studying to be a classical concert pianist. So this is our second video and we will be talking about the Baroque period. So if you haven't actually watched the first video about the Renaissance, go back and see it so you can understand better what we are going to talk about today. So the Baroque period refers to an era that started in the beginning of the 17th century and ended around the middle of the 18th century. This period included composers like Bach, Vivaldi, Handel. These are the standard ones that I can think on the top of my head, but yeah. The Baroque period saw an explosion of new musical styles with the introduction of the concerto, sonata, oratorio, suite, fugue, and the opera. So the loosening of the church's political control of Europe meant that non-religious music could now flourish, in particular instrumental music. So the idea that instruments should be grouped together in a standard way created the first versions of the modern orchestra that we are used to see nowadays. So an important type of instrumental music in the Baroque era was the concerto. Two of the greatest composers of concertos were Corelli and Vivaldi. Bach is regarded as one of the greatest geniuses in the history of music, and that's because besides the fact that he composed brilliant and beautiful pieces, he demonstrated a standard approach to harmony that dominated music until the late 19th century. So the system of modes that I taught in the last video finally crumbled away and accidentals were added, so the major minor key system was developed. So if you don't know what accidental means, go back to the last video where I talk about it. Some other standard composers from the period were Handel and Scarlatti. I will leave YouTube links for you in the video description with some standard Baroque pieces. One particular piece that I am very fond of is the Sonata in D minor by Scarlatti. That's one of the videos that I will put on the description with one of my favorite pianists, Marta Argerich, playing this piece. So make sure you watch it. So in the Baroque period, the orchestra started to take shape, mainly in the strings, and the violins became the dominant instrument and most important in orchestras. The first opera was written in 1597 called Daphne, and it was composed by Peri. He is a less known Italian composer, which is often called the inventor of the opera. But the first truly great opera was composed by Monteverdi in 1607 and was called Orfeo. I will leave a link in the description so you can listen to this piece because it's fantastic. So the oratorio was born about the same time as the opera. This vocal music was at first very similar to operas. They had arias, choruses, and recitatives. They were acted out with scenery and costumes. The main difference was that an oratorio was based on a sacred story. So eventually oratorios ceased to be acted out and were given musical presentation only. Handel's Messiah is an example of an oratorio. A Passion is a special oratorio telling the story of Christ's crucifixion. Besides recitatives, arias, and choruses, Bach also includes settings of chorales, which were German hymn themes. Bach also composed more than 200 church cantatas. Cantata means song and sonata means played, by the way. So the cantatas are for soloists and choruses accompanied by orchestra and continuo, and are like miniature oratorios. A fine example is number 140 by Bach, based upon the choral Sleeper's Wake. During the Baroque period, instrumental music became equally important as vocal music. So let's talk first about the fugue. A fugue is a contrapunto piece, and if you watch the first video, you would know that contrapunto means a piece of music with two or more independent melodic lines. So the fugue is based upon the idea of imitation, and it is usually written in 3 or 4 parts called voices. And these are referred to as soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. I also talked about SATB voicing in the first video, so if you don't remember it, go back and watch it so you can refresh your mind. The most famous example that I can give you about this type of composition is the 48 Preludes and Fugues by Bach. So I'll leave you a link for you to watch it as well. The next important type of instrumental music is the suite. A suite is a collection of dances for one or more instruments. Many were written for harpsichord. They contain a German Allemande in 4/4 time at a moderate speed, a French courante in 3/2 time at a moderately fast speed, a Spanish saraband in a slow triple time, and a jig usually in compound time. So don't worry about the time now, because I will get into that on a later video when I start explaining music theory. When you talk about times, you understand everything that I'm talking about here. So, however, before or after the jig, a composer might introduce dances such as the minuet, which is like a slow and like a waltz, or a gavotte. There are other examples, but the main ones are these. Sometimes a suite can begin also with a prelude, which is considered an opening piece. So let us talk about the sonatas. As I said before, sonata means sounded to be played. Many Baroque sonatas were for 2 violins and continuo, usually cello and harpsichord. In these trios, a violin was sometimes replaced with a flute or an oboe. There were 2 types: the sonata da camera, in English known as a chamber sonata. Camera is Italian for chamber. These were meant to be played in people's homes. The continuo would be played by harpsichord or lute. And the lute is an instrument that I showed you on the Renaissance video, if you remember it. So the second type was the sonata da chiesa, or church sonata. Chiesa is Italian for church. These were played in churches, obviously. The continuo was played by organ. These were far more serious than the chamber sonatas, so Corelli, Bach, Handel, Scarlatti all composed sonatas. Talking about the concerto, this word means get together. So there were 2 main settings of concerto. The idea of opposition and contrast led to 2 contrasting groups of instruments. A small group of soloists, usually 2 violins and a cello, called the concertino, and an orchestra of strings called tutti, which means everyone. So this way of playing without a soloist is called the concerto grosso. The solo concerto grew out of the concerto grosso and has a single instrument solo and a string orchestra. Vivaldi, for example, wrote more than 500 concertos, both concerto grosso and solo concertos. His most famous was the Four Seasons, that I bet you have heard at least a piece of it. But if you haven't, this will be in the video description anyways. This piece is like the most known piece among people, so yeah. So that's all for our second video. In the next one, we'll be getting into the classical period, and I'll have a couple more recommendations for you guys to listen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on our next video. Bye bye!